Lecture 13, The Diplomacy of World War II. Now it says 1941 to 1945, but really, the first thing on this is pretty much something that happens in 1943, which is why I gave you that insert lecture on 1942. So I'm going to jump around a lot in this one. This is the outline as originally laid out, but I'm going to try to insert some stuff here or there to try to give you a more complete picture. Okay? So at some point you might pause this, jot down this outline that you see here, but then be prepared for additional inserts further down the line. Okay. So next slide actually is kind of off topic in a way, but I mentioned it earlier, but I didn't have any pictures, so I'm going to leave these in here. That is, well, forgot about this. There's just some war posters that the fellow stuck in. Okay. With the bombing of Pearl Harbor, public sentiment for isolationism, goes in the toilet. Everybody's, pretty much on board for the war effort. There's always a few people who aren't, but in general, most people will want something done. So these posters are interesting. I'm going to throw something out here for you real quick. One thing about the propaganda posters in World War II, something interesting here. The Germans, there aren't really any Germans in this one. Here's Hitler, but it's kind of hard to see. But the Japanese in these things are almost always portrayed with ugly features. Okay, really thick glasses, buck teeth. There's even some where they have tails. Okay, so there's whole books written about is there some racism involved in the War of Japan that we don't have in the War of Germany. We hate the Nazis and everything they stand for, but they're still kind of like us, Caucasians, Protestant backgrounds or Catholic, European culture, Western culture. So there's actually books written on how the War of Japan is different from the War of Germany because of a racial component. But we won't go into that right now. But I mention it because we're going to get to the slide here of Japanese internment, which isn't on the outline. Okay, the guy originally kind of slid it in here. I touched on it a little bit, but it's something you need to know about. Anti-Japanese sentiment is very heavy after what happened at Pearl Harbor, and then the Bataan Death March. Okay, even before the Bataan Death March, it had been decided that Japanese Americans on the West Coast should be relocated to basically minimum security prisons, okay? Internment camps. Some people call them concentration camps, which by the very strictest definition of the rural, they could qualify, but I really don't like using that term because it's so closely associated with the German death camps where people were underfed and tortured and annihilated. The internment camps are basically, I'm not sugarcoating it, but they're basically, like I said, minimum security prisons. But there's fear that these Japanese Americans, now a lot of these people are American citizens. They've been convicted of nothing. Some of them are living here as immigrants. But they're forced to relocate, put on trains, and sent to various camps. So you can see here, it's not really high class living. They're living in barracks. There is wire around the enclosure. There's men in towers with guns, but they go to school. They're fed. They play baseball. So I'm not sugarcoating it. And generally, this is seen as a low light of American history. Yeah. In retrospect, obviously there are several major constitutional amendments were violated here because these people haven't been, convicted of any crime or anything. So I'm sure the book will probably talk more about this. Okay, if you were having to do the end of course test, this is the kind of thing that often, almost always shows up on the end of course test in an effort to balance out, American history with some of the darker sides. Okay, but none of this has actually anything to do with the point of his lecture outline, but this is where he put it, and so I wanted to cover it with you. Okay? So, Let's see. Diplomacy of World War II involves talking with people. All right. We're going to have what we call the Grand Alliance. This is what Churchill calls it. Okay? Now, there are all kinds of countries at war with Nazi Germany. Okay? Some small, some large. But the three most significant ones, of course, are the United States, Great Britain and her Commonwealth allies, like Australia, okay, and the Soviet Union. Okay? And so Churchill starts to call this the Grand Alliance. All these various countries coming together to defeat the Axis powers. Okay? Now, the first thing that on the PowerPoint slide, as originally done with the outline up there, says the Tehran Conference in 1943. That's where this lecture originally starts. But I'm going to kind of insert a few things here. So I've added a couple of slides, threw some photos in real quick, and talk about things happened prior to Tehran, because Tehran is at the very end of 1943. Okay. What's happening here is there's a series of high-level meetings between the various Allied powers. Now, when the Soviet Union had been invaded by the Germans, Churchill went over and visited with Stalin. Okay, kind of held his nose and went over to talk to Stalin. Trying to find some common ground that they could work on together. Okay. But in 1941, the United States and the British start talking, very high-level talks. First, not the very top level, but diplomats and generals, and they start talking about each other. I've pulled a screen up here over on the other monitor just to kind of get a feel for it. Starting about January, okay, military planners start talking. This is 1941. Okay, Pearl Harbor's in December of 1941. In January and February and March, Allied, or not Allied, but American and British military leaders are talking back and forth at a conference about what could we do, or what do we need to do if America were to enter a war. Remember, I told you that Roosevelt is kind of bending the neutrality rules. He's being a little bit deceitful to the American public. Okay? But they're laying plans for and I don't necessarily know that he necessarily felt it was a sure thing that the U.S. would get into war, but he wanted to have some kind of preparations if they were. Okay? So various conferences were held throughout the early part of 1941. Right? You don't just don't get right together, the president and the prime minister. They chit chat, okay, at lower levels. Right? Somewhere along the way in this, and I don't remember the exact timing. It's not important. I've actually read an article about it once. It was pretty interesting. The Americans adopted a new war plan. Okay, so prior to the war, we had all these various war plans. They were color-coded for different combatants. There's a war plan red and a war plan black. The war plan for war against Japan. The war plan for the war against Japan was war plan orange. Okay. Germany, black, red, I forget. But they have a whole file drawer full of these things. What do we do if we go to war with this country? But these staff level meetings are going, if we do end up in war, we could go to get war against multiple countries. We could be having to fight the Japanese and the Germans, or the Germans and the Italians, or eventually we ended up fighting the Germans, the Italians, and the Japanese. Okay? And so they came up, the American planners, and they're talking to your British folks too, of course, came up with a series of plans. They were the rainbow plans because they were multicolored. Okay, all the little different colors for each country. What if you have to fight several countries at once? So they drew up these rainbow plans, trying to come up. One was for a defensive war, blah. And the one that finally got adopted, the one they said, this is the one that looks like we'll probably have to go with, was something called Rainbow 5. Rainbow 5. Rainbow 5 basically, I'm going to boil this down, says that if we end up going to war with Germany and Japan at the same time, that the Germans will be seen as the bigger threat, the number one priority. So Rainbow Five basically calls for a defensive war against Japan and an offensive war against Germany because they're seen as the bigger threat. Okay? They've seized large chunks of Europe. Right? Japan's seized large parts of the Pacific Ocean, but how many people actually live in the Pacific Ocean? Right? So this becomes known as a Europe first strategy. We will deal with the problems of Europe first. And, like I said, fight a holding action against the Japanese. Okay? So this is all being worked out months before Pearl Harbor. Now, in August of 1941, which is still 4 months before Pearl Harbor, Franklin Roosevelt slips out of Washington, supposedly on a fishing trip. He goes out on a presidential yacht. But once he's out of sight of land, he transfers to a U.S. Navy cruiser and sails to the coast of Canada. Here he meets Winston Churchill. Okay? Let me get my pen here. So here's Roosevelt. Here's Churchill. And of course they have all kinds of underlings and ambassadors and military generals and admirals with him. And they meet on a British battleship, and then they meet on the U.S. cruiser. They go back and forth. And it's the first time these two guys have actually met in person. Now, they've been corresponding with each other about the situation. I think they might have talked on the telephone, but because there was an underwater cable that allowed for telephone communication. But this is the first time they've met for face-to-face. And they have a lot of the common ground. They don't see eye to eye on everything, but they all agree on what's going on. And while there, they will write a document that becomes known as the Atlantic Charter. Okay? The Atlantic Charter, because it's written in the Atlantic. And it's not real important for the book may mention it. It doesn't have a lot to do with World War II per se. It's more of a statement of principles. Okay, that the U.S. and the Great Britain go on record as saying, this is what this war is being fought for, and this is what we think should be done after the war. And sometimes you see it, like in libraries and stuff, framed on the wall. So it's not like the U.S. Constitution or anything terribly important, but it's like an open statement of principles between the United States and the United Kingdom on where they might like to do on this war. And this is like I said, 4 months before Pearl Harbor. Now, when Pearl Harbor hits in December, Churchill, of course, first of all, is like, thank goodness, now the Americans are in the war. This changes everything. Churchill quickly comes over to the United States to spend some time with Roosevelt in the White House, because what he needs to make sure is that we'll stick with this Europe first strategy. The American public, of course, because the Japanese had hit us in Pearl Harbor, a lot of people desperately want to focus on Japan because of what they've done to us. And, but Churchill wants to make sure we're going to stick with the Europe first strategy. So he comes and spends some time at the White House, where he supposedly saw the ghost of Abraham Lincoln. And the Americans are on board for, well, no, we'll stick with Europe first. However, because of the emergency in the Pacific, the military setbacks, we will have to rush some troops to the Pacific. So originally we were supposed to be fighting a holding action, but to have a holding action, you still need resources. So for the first few months of war, we are sending, airplanes and ships and men to the Pacific to help stabilize the situation. But our primary goal is always going to be to worry about Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. Okay? And I'm coming up on the 15-minute mark, so I'll have to stop here and continue on the other slides on another video.